Hi everyone, it's Dr. Becton. This video is an overview of adjustment disorder. As is true for each of the videos on my page, reviewing this video is not a substitution for your own thorough review of the DSM-5. At the most basic level, adjustment disorders are maladaptive responses to stressors that are beyond what is culturally or developmentally expected under the circumstances. So we're going to take a look at what some of the criterion are and describe them based on the text of the DSM-5. A primary feature of adjustment disorder is the presence of emotional or behavioral symptoms in response to an identifiable stressor. This is really the essential feature. A stressor can both be a big T trauma or a little t trauma. That's what can be used to meet the standard in Criterion A. There are some important factors to consider. In some cases, while the traumatic experience might meet the Criterion A for acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, if other symptoms of acute stress or post-traumatic stress are not present, then an adjustment disorder diagnosis might be more appropriate. Relatedly, for stressors where some of the subsidiary symptoms of acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder are present, but the Criterion A stressor doesn't meet the Criterion A standard for acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, this is also a case when adjustment disorder might be a more appropriate diagnosis. Stressors can be single events or recurring events. They can be persistent in some cases. They might even accompany specific developmental events like experiencing a transition from living at home with one's parents to living alone, or perhaps going to school or beginning or ending a romantic relationship. In some cases, adjustment disorder may be appropriate when there is an extended or complicated experience of bereavement, but it's really important for us to take a look at what the grief reaction actually looks like and consider diagnosis related to that. Symptoms of acute stress disorder may begin immediately after exposure to the stressor and must begin within 3 months of the onset of the stressor in order to meet criteria for the diagnosis. Additionally, the symptoms do not persist for more than 6 months after exposure to the stressor or its consequences has ended. As a reminder, in some cases, exposure to the stressor or its consequences may be chronic. Thus, the symptoms may also be protracted or quite enduring. A person with an adjustment disorder has an emotional or behavioral response to a known stressor that is out of proportion to what is culturally or developmentally expected in response to that stressor and the context of the stressful experience. Additionally, the response does not represent what is considered a typical or normative response to bereavement. There are several specifiers for adjustment disorder. When making this diagnosis, you would need to specify if it is with depressed mood, with anxiety, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, with disturbance of conduct, with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct, or if it is unspecified. Let's take a look at depressed mood first. In order to meet this specifier, one would need to exhibit low mood or tearfulness or hopelessness as the predominating symptoms. So this specifier is only appropriate when a pattern of low mood, tearfulness, or feelings of hopelessness dominate the symptom presentation. And dominate is going to be the key word when we're looking at any of these specifiers. When we're thinking about making the specifier with anxiety, the person's constellation of symptoms would need to be predominated by patterns of nervousness or worry or jitteriness, or perhaps separation anxiety, separation from a parental figure or an authority figure or a caregiver. And there may be some other relationships that may meet the criterion for that. So you want to take a look at your DSM-5 as well as the scholarly literature for more information about that. The next specifier is with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. And this one can be really tricky or challenging for people. To meet this specifier, a combination of depression and anxiety predominates the clinical picture. So note that this is not simply the presence of both anxious symptoms and depressive symptoms. This specifier is appropriate when both the depression and the anxiety are the primary emotional disturbance, and neither of them tends to rise above the other in the clinical picture or constellation of symptoms. Next, we'll look at with disturbance of conduct. So, the DSM-5 briefly suggests that a disturbance of conduct is the predominant feature for this specifier. We can take a look at the DSM-4-TR for a little bit more information. So, we'll note that the DSM-4-TR, of course, has been replaced by the DSM-5, but there's a little bit more detail there. So, I want to have us take a look there. For this specifier, a person would need to have predominant manifestations of disturbances in conduct where there are perhaps violations of the rights of others or where age or culturally appropriate norms are being broken. Some examples listed in the DSM-4-TR are truancy, vandalism, or reckless behavior. So we want to apply our clinical minds and our judgment here to determine what would meet the standard for disturbance of conduct, since we don't have a lot of direction about that in the DSM-5. The next specifier is with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct. So, as before, there would need to be predominant manifestations of both emotional symptoms and conduct symptoms in order to apply this particular specifier. Note, this is not simply one experience of depression or anxiety in combination with a serious conduct problem. Likewise, it is not one episode of behavioral acting out in combination with some predominating emotional problems. But it is important that in order to meet this specifier, there would need to exist some intensity or severity in both sets of symptoms when it comes to emotional disturbance and conduct disturbance. The unspecified specifier is reserved for reactions to stressors that are beyond the developmental and cultural expectations and can't be classified or qualified into any of the other subtypes. So some of these reactions are going to result in impairment in social, occupational, or academic functioning, but are not specific to a disturbance of conduct, to anxiety or depressed mood, or a combination of those symptoms. So here we have some additional information. You'll note that the slide simply says additional information, so I want you to pay attention with your listening ears. And I want to refer to the DSM-4-TR here. And I do that because the DSM-4-TR listed a specifier for adjustment disorder that included acute or chronic. Acute was used to indicate persistence of symptoms that was less than 6 months after the onset of the stressor. And chronic was used to represent when symptoms lasted 6 months or longer and was applied when the stressor was chronic or had enduring consequences. Although the acute and chronic specifiers are not listed in the DSM-5, it's really important for us to note that there remains an option for there to be a chronic pattern of adjustment problems in relation to chronic stressors or experience of long-term consequences. Adjustment disorders may be diagnosed in combination with other mental health conditions. However, adjustment disorder may not be diagnosed in combination with an acute stress disorder or a post-traumatic stress disorder. Adjustment disorders often occur in combination with medical conditions, including a new diagnosis of a medical illness. So sometimes there may be psychological symptoms associated with new knowledge about one's medical condition. And as with all sets of symptoms in the DSM-5, the symptoms must be differentiated from normative reactions to stressful situations or stressors in one's life. It is developmentally appropriate for people to get upset or to have less than ideal responses to stressful situations. Here's a place where we really want to think about the emotional expression in particular cultures, or even in particular age groups and maybe even generations within a same culture. Adjustment disorder must only be diagnosed when an adverse event precipitates an emotional or behavioral response that exceeds the cultural or developmental expectations and results in a significant functional impairment. I hope this has been helpful. I'm sure I'll see you online again soon.